Epping Forest is an ancient woodland with thousands of years of history, and while a lot of the forest is enjoyed by families taking kids out for the day, or cyclists enjoying the sights, or even fishermen trying their luck in any one of the lakes and ponds, it's the dark history that's hidden within Epping Forest that's given the area its notorious reputation as one of the most haunted forests in the world. With everything from ancient armies heard echoing through Iron Age earthworks, through to the spirits of vicious highwaymen luring you deeper into the labyrinth of ancient trees, there's no shortage of ghost stories tied to this ancient forest. So we're doing something a little different today. The eagle-eyed viewers among you may notice that I'm not exactly in my usual little hovel. As a little bit of a special episode to say thank you to each and every one of you, I thought it's about time I took you out to one of these places that I sit down and chat with you about. And that's why we find ourselves in Epping Forest in Essex. So the actual woodland known as Epping Forest is thousands of years old and has seen so much history. The forest itself once stretched from the Thames River to the Wash at the top of Norfolk, absolutely huge. It's obviously not that big anymore, a lot of it was actually cut down during the Anglo-Saxon times, but still, it's a massive forest and it's very old. The woodland has been used by humans for millennia, and we can still see evidence of this in the form of Iron Age earthworks, which are basically where ancient tribes would dig out ditches and build mounds, kind of like manipulating the ground to fortify an area against a neighbouring tribe. It's also been used as a royal hunting ground when apparently in the 12th century, King Henry II gave it the status of royal forest. This meant that commoners could still gather firewood and turn the cattle out in the forest, but only royals could hunt deer there. And this was still the case in the 1500s. Apparently it was really popular with King Henry VIII. He's said to really enjoy hunting in the forest, although there's no actual evidence of him hunting there. But he went so far as to build a hunting lodge, so I would say he was pretty keen on the place. His daughter Queen Elizabeth I was also apparently quite fond of hunting in Epping Forest, and the hunting lodge her dad had built was actually refurbished for her. And it's actually still standing to this day. You can go and visit Queen Elizabeth's hunting lodge in Chingford, as it's now a museum. But that's not to say that the poor folk didn't make the most of the forest too. When the bubonic plague hit London in 1665, people actually moved out of London and into Epping Forest at the time, like a bit of social distancing to try and survive. But they're not the only people that have called the forest home over the years. Especially during the 18th century, the forest was perfect for criminals and highwaymen to hide out in. I mean, think about it, it's a huge forest, super dense trees to disappear into, and it's pretty close to London. So you can only imagine the kinds of things that went on in Epping Forest during that time. Not a super safe time to be travelling around in the area. By the early 19th century, it was looking like Epping Forest was going to be completely cleared, like other forests in the area had been, to allow for more farmland and more housing. Higher up people in the area were starting to enclose off parts of the forest, which then encroached onto the whole, allowing the commoners to freely graze their cattle and lop off branches of trees for firewood. Eventually though, in 1878, the Epping Forest Act was passed, which, amongst other things, ended the royal forest status, continued grazing rights, but most importantly, required that the forest, quote, shall at all times keep Epping Forest unenclosed and unbuilt upon as an open space for the recreation and enjoyment of the people. On the 6th of May 1882, Queen Victoria actually visited and declared that she was dedicating Epping Forest to the use and enjoyment of her people for all time. And so Epping Forest gained another name, the People's Forest. And so now you've got the woodland, but Epping Forest is actually a district in itself, so like an area controlled by the council. The forest spans almost 6,000 acres, or just over 9 square miles, whereas the actual district of Epping Forest covers 130 square miles, just to give you an idea of the size. So this is a pretty ambitious story, plenty of ground for me to cover, but I'm mainly going to be focusing on the forest itself and areas very close to the forest, because it seems to be where a lot of the not so nice history took place, and then of course by extension of that, where a lot of the alleged paranormal activity is said to happen. Because let's face it, looking at this forest, it looks like a haunted forest. Very dense trees, lots of opportunities to get lost in, or hide in. Apparently over the years, a lot of buried treasure has been found in and around the forest itself, which, I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? Obviously, you've got the ancient history with people finding treasure dating back to the Anglo-Saxon times, but then you've also got the forest connection with highwaymen. who would need somewhere secure to hide their loot. So it looks like on some occasions they made their hiding spot a little too secure and never uncovered it again. So funnily enough, metal detectorists love the forest. But you know what else is super easy to hide in a really dense forest like Epping? Bodies. And there have been lots of them. Because the forest has been the perfect location to either commit a murder or hide the body. And by saying that, I'm not endorsing that you go to Epping Forest to, just don't do that. Murder is very bad. I'm not going to list off everybody that's been discovered because we would literally be here all day. But there have been a few really notable cases in and around the forest, with some still being unsolved to this day. Possibly the most famous is the Babes in the Wood murders. On the 17th of June 1970, a dog walker who was walking through Epping Forest with his Labrador came across a little hide, like what bird watchers make with branches and things. Well, he didn't, his dog did. The dog wouldn't come back. Obviously, it got the smell of something, so the dog walker went over and discovered the bodies of 2 children. Turns out they'd been there for a while and were identified by dental records to be 11-year-old Susan Blatchford and 12-year-old Gary Hanlon. They'd both been missing for 78 days since the 31st of March. The case went cold. They had no leads on who could have done it until a convicted murderer, Ronald Jebson, who was already serving a life sentence for the assault and murder of another child, he came forward and basically confessed to the horrific things he did to the children before he murdered them, and got himself another 2 life sentences. Some cold cases that have happened in the forest are absolutely wild too. A husband and wife were shot a few days before Christmas on the 22nd of December 1989 and were found in their car on one of the roads in Epping Forest. Like execution style, someone had sat in the rear seats of the car and shot them from behind. Brutal. In 1990, a woman called Patricia Lee Parsons was found slumped over in her car after being shot 3 times in the head with something that could possibly have been a crossbow. Her murder is still unsolved, although it's thought to have been a hit job as Patricia worked as a masseuse and escort. And she had a little black book containing the details of all 200 of her clients, which included some well-known celebrities. The story goes that potentially she was silenced by one of these clients as she was threatening to go to the newspapers with this weapon of mass reputation destruction. And the little black book was never found. But there are so many more, and it kind of doesn't bear thinking about all the victims that we potentially don't know about that have been buried in the forest over the years. It seems as well that the forest attracts people who are looking to end it all, as there have been so many documented suicides taking place within the woodland too. And where you've got a forest as large and as old as this one, witchcraft is never going to be too far behind, because there's stories of witchcraft being practiced within Epping Forest for centuries. But then there's also talk about satanic rituals, like full-on human sacrifice, child abuse rituals. And I wouldn't normally include them, as people like to say, oh, it's the Satanists, about a lot of potentially haunted locations. But this, unfortunately, seems to be a potentially bona fide case. Literally, there was apparently a case that went to court in the Old Bailey in 1991 where a girl testified that every Monday, Wednesday and Friday, her parents would take her to the Gypsy Rodney Smith Memorial Stone within the forest, where her and her sister would be forced to take part in things no child should ever have to go through. Her sister's testimony also included that babies and children younger than the girls would be sacrificed on the stone as part of the ritual. And so obviously that is pretty heavy. Infuriatingly, I couldn't find any other reference to this court case other than a couple of news articles from the Scottish Guardian. So I don't know the outcome of the trial or anything more. But a lot of people have mentioned that they've been out walking through the woods or camping and they've just so happened to stumble across what looks like a patch of scorched earth. And then they'll notice the symbols etched onto nearby trees. And then they'll get that pit in the bottom of their stomachs that tells them that something is definitely not right and they should definitely get out of their area immediately. Yeah, it could just be people messing about, but what if it isn't? So you've got thousands of years of history of people living and dying in the area. You've got criminals hiding out, carrying out their extracurricular activities within the forest, and then potentially very dark rituals being performed in what seems like alarming regularity. Yeah, you can see why Epping Forest has the reputation that it does. So should we go take a walk and I can actually show you some of these areas? I mean, we may as well. We're here instead of in my spare bedroom. So the first place I wanted to bring you to is Ambrosbury Banks. This is one of 2 Iron Age earthworks that have been found within the forest. And so just looking at it, you can see where these ditches and mounds would have been. And they still look pretty impressive nowadays, like just some mounds among the trees. Like you can see that something has gone on here. But when they were built, the ditches would have been 3 meters deep with the mounds 3 meters high. So you're gonna feel fairly well protected inside there if you needed to be. But the legend connected to Ambrosbury Banks is that it was potentially either the camp or the actual battlefield where our very own warrior queen Boudica fought her final battle with the Romans. And we've got accounts from a Roman historian Tacitus about what went down in that final battle. But you know, history written by the victors and all of that. But he said that by 61 AD, Boudica and her army had been wreaking havoc on the Romans and had actually been winning. And they apparently outnumbered the Roman army 10-1 in this final battle. The Britons had brought wives and children in wagons to watch this battle. Like, that's how sure they were of this final victory. Kind of like, come and watch Daddy at work, kids, while he slaughters a bunch of Romans. And these wagons were positioned around the edges of the battlefield. But in a way, that would be their undoing. The Britons were driven back by the Romans, but they were trapped by the wagons. The Romans had also slaughtered the ox, so the wagons couldn't be moved, and so killing the Britons was like shooting fish in a barrel. Apparently 80,000 Britons were slaughtered that day, while the Romans lost 400 men. After the crushing defeat, some accounts say that Boudica got sick and died, but others say that she and her daughters ate poisoned berries and killed themselves. And so that's the legend, but it seems to be quite widely accepted nowadays that this final battle didn't actually take place here and was actually potentially in Manchester, which is besides the point, but I grew up like 5 minutes away from Manchester. So why am I all the way out here to talk about the battle? Thing is, we just don't know for sure. Like, there aren't any reliable accounts or evidence to say for sure. But there are some people that remain convinced that Ambrosbury Banks is most definitely the site of the final battle, or at least that Boudica camped here before that defeat, as on more than one occasion, the muffled sounds of ancient pagan drumming and soldiers marching have been heard echoing around this area. Some people even claim to have witnessed the figure of the warrior queen herself wandering the mounds. Is this actually Queen Boudica and her army? Or is it someone else, maybe from the time that these earthworks were first built in 500 BC? Or are people seeing what they want to see, knowing the story attached to this part of the ancient forest? Who knows? The other Iron Age earthworks within the forest, which is where we are now, is known as Loughton Camp. And it's thought that somewhere along the banks of these earthworks, a very not nice man used to hide out here, Mr. Dick Turpin. And he's pretty much the most infamous highwayman in English history. But he wouldn't just use the forest to hide away in. He would actually hold up carriages that travelled through the forest roads and apparently would just terrorise the local people. And there's one story that says that he once broke into an old woman's home and forced her down onto her own hearth and started burning her, basically torturing her until she gave up where she was hiding her gold coins that he then relieved her of. But the thing is, while it seems that Dick Turpin was quite fond of this particular area, we don't know for sure. There are loads of other areas within the forest that claim to be the actual hideout of the highwayman, but we just don't know. And I think the reason that it's become a bit murky is because Turpin kept returning to Epping Forest again and again. While he was part of the violent Essex gang, and afterwards when he struck out on his own and went freelance. It was close to London, so it was convenient, but it's super thick and dense, so easy to hide in, which, again, convenient for a criminal. And it was during one of these times where Dick Turpin was hiding out after trying to avoid being arrested for another fatal shooting that he was caught up in, where he murdered a man called Thomas Morris within the forest, who had recognised him and was about to hand him in to the police. You know when police say, oh, don't approach this criminal, they're like thought to be armed and dangerous? This is why. And so now people have reported witnessing the figure of a man dressed in a long black cloak and a tricorn hat, who they believe to be Dick Turpin, both here at Loughton Camp and elsewhere in the forest. Sometimes he's seen riding his faithful horse, Black Bess, galloping across the forest, and sometimes witnesses claim to see a woman holding on to Dick Turpin's waist while he's riding away. She's got an iron grip on his waist, but her feet are basically dragging on the floor. The stories say that this is the old woman who's trying to reclaim her stolen gold coins after Turpin took them from her. So back when Epping Forest was used as common grazing ground, they actually created a bunch of lakes and ponds within the forest alongside the natural bodies of water that cattle could use to drink from. Over the years, even more pools were created, with some being the result of World War II bombs being dropped in the area. And so now there are over 100 ponds within the forest, and some of them you can fish from if that's your kind of thing. But there's one that's earned the name the suicide pool. Don't really think I need to give you much explanation on why it's called that. But the story goes that this particular pond was the little midnight rendezvous of a young couple. And these were the standard star-crossed lovers. They loved each other and wanted to live happily ever after, but they came from two different backgrounds, and apparently the families would never approve the match. So they decided to be together for eternity instead, and walked into one of these pools, never to surface again. Other versions of this story aren't quite so romantic, saying that it was the girl's father that followed her out to this pool, saw what was going on, and got so angry that he drowned his daughter in the water. And then the heartbroken fella drowned himself to be with her. But either way, apparently after these deaths, the water turned black and sludgy, the plants around the pool wilted and died, and animals would refuse to come near this particular body of water. Which, I don't know, it kind of just sounds to me like what would happen if two bodies were left to rot in what is basically standing water. Like, it's got nowhere to drain off. But either way, apparently this particular suicide pool now has a super evil atmosphere, and it's very negative and dark. And if unsuspecting people get too close to it, potentially they feel compelled to take a forever dive, even if they've had no inclination of suicidal thoughts before. Allegedly, a woman in 1887 jumped into this same pool, and not long after that, a serving girl called Emma Morgan killed herself and her baby right here in the water. Even the paranormal author Elliot O'Donnell said he was doing an overnight investigation next to this pond where he saw the residual echo of a murder happen right in front of him, which ended in the victim's body being thrown in the water. And if you're looking at this pond that I'm standing next to thinking, Claire, that water isn't very black, then well done you, because this pool isn't the one I'm talking about, as far as I know. And that's because no one actually knows where this infamous killer pool is. Which, that's throwing some major red flags, you know? How do you know that it's got a weird vibe? How do you know that wildlife avoid the area if you don't know where it is? So you can pick one, you can't have both, because otherwise your story doesn't make sense. In 1959, there was a letter printed in the Essex Countryside magazine where one reader was asking for the location of this supposed suicide pool. In the next edition, someone said she was sure that it was the Wake Valley Pond. But then in the next edition after that, there was a writer that said, no, it's not Wake Valley. I know exactly where the pool is, but I'm never going to tell a soul. And it was this letter. This woman claimed that the reason that she wouldn't let anyone know the location is because the area was wicked and dangerous. And apparently it was her that had been saying all this about the water being black, the animals dying, and how the pool entices people to come in and kill themselves. So what do you think about this one? I think I can see from the point of view of not wanting to share the location of this alleged suicide pool, because it seems like people flock to areas where other people have chosen to end it all, so it just becomes this vicious cycle, a bit like the suicide forest in Japan. And Epping Forest doesn't need any help in that department. People come to the woodland to do just that anyway. But then also, it makes a better story, doesn't it? If you say this place is evil and dangerous, but then you give people exact coordinates, people are gonna go check it out for themselves. Naysayers and skeptics are gonna say there's nothing going on here, and it kind of takes a bit of the creep factor away from the story, doesn't it? And like I say, Epping Forest really doesn't need any help in giving out exact coordinates to prime unaliving locations. In 1907, there was a book published called Lays and Legends of the Forest of Essex. And in this book, there was another story, this time in poem form, of a suicide involving one of these pools. The story goes that a young serving girl called Kate had fallen in love with a guy called Sir Eduard of Alderton Hall. They'd got it on, Kate had got pregnant. The thing was, Edward was engaged to be married and he wasn't about to break off his wedding plans. So on the night before the wedding, Kate decided to kill herself and her baby daughter by walking into the pool. She's shouting into the wind, Edward, forgive him, I die. And he's there partying hard, last night as a bachelor, but he can hear this shouting. Not because she's in earshot and no one else can hear her. The morning after, he goes out for a morning walk and just so happens to head in the direction of this pool, where he finds the body of Kate and their illegitimate child. At that point, it's quite sad, but in a horrible way. Well, at least that's that problem dealt with nice and easy. So life goes on. Edward and his now wife Alice have a son together. And one day, this son is out gathering flowers with his nursemaid. The poem goes on to say that the very best flowers are over near that same lake. Obviously, the son and nursemaid have no idea of the history. They go over to the banks of this lake when the nursemaid sees the apparition of a baby tangled in the weeds. She freaks out, gets the heck out of there, leaves Edward's son alone. The son also sees the baby and reaches out to try and help her. Apparently, their hands meet and Edward's son is pulled underneath the water where he drowns. Back at Alderton Hall, Sir Edward, obviously he's grief-stricken, but the poem kind of says, I don't think it's relief for the guilt he felt, but it's definitely like Edward went on with his life feeling like he'd definitely atoned for how badly he'd handled the whole situation with Kate. And so while the specific pools may not be general knowledge, it's probably a decent idea to just avoid the water where you can. While I was doing the research for this story, there were so many accounts of fishermen who were set up for some night fishing, having to bail halfway through because of something weird happened, or they just got too creeped out by the atmosphere. But one place that doesn't seem to be in any dispute about how haunted it is the main road through Epping Forest itself, Epping New Road. And there seems to be a lot of activity centering around the Wake Arms roundabout. There's everything from a headless motorbike rider through to phantom horsemen galloping down the road. Obviously, some believe that this horseman is, again, Dick Turpin. Another phenomenon that's been reported multiple times along this road is that phantom figures will step out in front of you while you're driving, causing you to almost swerve off the road. You'll get out just to check that that person that you almost definitely hit, like there's no way that you didn't hit them, only to find absolutely nothing there at all. In some reports, it's the ghost of a young girl dressed in white that will just step out in front of you onto the road. But then other times it will be a man covered in blood, running out the tree line straight towards your car. Some believe it's the spirit of a man who died after being hit by a car and that he's desperate for help because he doesn't know he's dead. And while I couldn't find any specific names, it's not beyond the realms of imagination. This road seems to be notorious for fatal accidents, everything from hit and runs to actual car collisions. So I think on that note, it might be a good idea to get back to safety. What a journey we've been on today, right? And I don't think we've even really scratched the surface of the size of this area and the amount of hauntings that have apparently taken place here. There are so many ghost stories and so many reports of people in the forest seeing and hearing things that they just couldn't explain. Everything from seeing shadows out the corner of their eye, following them along the paths, right through to actually being pushed by something unseen. One thing that so many people report, both visitors and locals, is the creepy atmosphere that the forest has in some places. Like you'll wander into a clearing late at night, maybe having a few drinks with the lads, but you're still very much with it enough to notice the absolute deafening silence. That there's not a single sound of any kind of animal, which in a forest of that size is very unnatural. Unless, of course, there's danger very close by. But maybe it's danger that's not of this world. So if you do decide to take a wander through Epping Forest, especially at night, make sure you don't go alone. Partly because it is a big place and a dense forest, you might get lost. Partly because you might experience something you can't explain, and it's always good to have a second opinion. But also partly because you never know what you might stumble across, or who. But of course, let me know your thoughts. What did you think about Epping Forest? Does it deserve to be known as one of the most haunted forests in the world? Or is it all just overactive imaginations, making up stories because the forest has a tendency to look a bit creepy at night? Or somewhere in the middle? Let me know. I feel like with Epping Forest, yes, there is likely something to some of these stories. These trees have seen an awful lot of violence and darkness. And we will never know how many victims of horrific crimes might still be buried in the massive woodland. That's already going to be harbouring some pretty dark, negative energy, without even touching the stories about dark rituals and potentially even sacrifices. But I also think that the stories from history have a lot to do with the alleged hauntings that are being reported. I feel like they would learn that Dick Turpin would hide out there and, oh look, I just saw a highwayman galloping on a black horse. Or, these lovers tragically died here in this pool and now I can feel them calling to me. I don't want to just boil it right down to that, but I think that at least for some of these stories, that might have something to do with it. But let me know, I would love to know what you think. Because there is no denying that as soon as the sun goes down, Epping Forest has an incredibly creepy vibe. And also a huge thank you to my friends at Eulogy Media for making this special possible. Without them, you would not be watching this video right now. And so if you watched this entire video and you've enjoyed it and you're still watching and you've not subscribed yet, like look, this is what happens when my subscriber count grows. I get to do cool things like this and bring you even better videos. So help me out and chuck me a sub if you wouldn't mind. It really helps me out. But anyway, that is all from me today. I've been outside the safety of my hovel for much too long and must now retreat to the stacks of books I have piling up for research on some upcoming videos. Honestly, some of the stories I have coming up, They are a lot. You're not going to want to miss them. So I cannot wait. I'm so excited to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe.